Welcome everyone to a new episode of Non-Duality with Kyle Hubin and Saeed. The title of today's episode is Life After Awakening. So back in episode 1, we discussed the story of awakening, but we didn't go into detail on all the years after awakening and what life was like as a young person achieving spiritual enlightenment and living in the modern world. So that's what we'll be talking about today. So welcome back, Kyle.
Thank you, Saeed. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, so let's go back to your life, I'd say right before awakening, back in 2002, you were in college and you
So,
had a deadline.
right, yeah, I had a deadline for salvation. Um, the personal story had kind of developed in an expiry date for being able to find freedom, and that was by the age of 20. And so my 20th birthday came and went, and I hadn't achieved the necessary criteria for freedom, and so the whole personal story just fell apart. And uh, yeah, so what was the question? I just completely drew a blank there.
Um, so I wanted to like really contrast the before and the after awakening
All right.
because you were a college student at the time.
Yeah, I was in photojournalism in college, and I had just finished my first year in college. And um, and by the time I was in my first year of college, the personal story had hit a point of just insanely intense suffering, internal just chaos, and um, just constant uh, self-rejection every day, every minute.
Mm.
And and then by the end of the first year of college, um, yeah, my birthday was in February, so a couple months after that, um, the whole thing just fell apart. Then there was an awakening that happened, an enlightenment. I noticed the word awakening seems very confusing nowadays. Like, I know it's used, thrown around to describe um, the awakening process,
Mm.
and then there's people that use it to describe enlightenment. And so it's like, which is it? So the enlightenment experience, or the uh, the enlightenment shift, that happened in April, just after uh, college, the first year of college finished. So
So right after you turned 20 in February, was your practice amplified? Like step one, prove
yeah,
what's real.
well, the pain was amplified. So
Hmm.
to counter that, the was amplified too, and there was more of a desperation going on to solve this giant problem of me. And and so, yeah, it got to a point where it was just, I was a grade A Zen student, and
Hmm.
eventually that didn't even work. So
Could like your friends and family tell what was going on
no, no,
before the awakening?
no, nobody had a clue.
You were just normal
Yeah,
joking around with friends and
I think part of what intensifies the pain in people that are going through that dark night is that you're really attached to this belief that you're alone, that you can't, no one can understand you, and not your particular situation. And because it's so unique. You're just, you're really one of those unlucky
Mm.
cases that just can't be solved, you know? So yeah, there's very much an aloneness there, even though there's also the fact that, not everybody is capable of meeting you where you are, where you need to meet. And, that was the case with my family. My
Mm.
parents were not, they're loving people, but they just weren't capable of meeting me where I would have needed to be met, to move through that with guidance from someone in the flesh. So yeah, I was on all by my lonesome during that period. Yeah.
Not having anyone, was that ultimately like a positive that
Yeah,
uh
well, at the time I wouldn't have labeled it as a positive, but
right.
in retrospect, it definitely helped speed things along
Mm.
and become very incisive about the types of teachings or materials I was looking at to try to help, you know.
So in April 2002, the shift happened, and that was like the end of the college year. And what was so different about your daily experience?
Uh, the silence, quiet, uh, the phenomenal world was was much more amplified. Everything had an aliveness to it, still does have an aliveness to it because, once the character's removed from the situation, then the stage setting becomes the main center of the show. The background comes to the foreground, and everything is just really pronounced with consciousness and aliveness. So yeah, that changed, and just um I remember shortly after that I went on a date with a girl who kind of played a big part in the whole personal drama. I went on a date with her after, and I just kept saying over and over again, I can't believe how quiet it is, how silent it is, and wherever we went. And she just, she gave me the side eye or the cock eye, like,
Mm.
what the hell is wrong with you? But it was really hitting me just how quiet it actually is in the world when you're quiet, when there is no, narration going on at all. You
Mm.
know, it's actually not very noisy, even if there's a bunch of cars driving by or you're in a crowd of people. Like we went to a pub and I was just sitting there. I was like, it's one of those things. It almost felt like, when you lift the needle off a record and is there, it's kind of like that. And yet you look around, everybody's laughing and drinking their whatever. But it was kind of funny actually that way.
Mm. Was the shift the end of the narrator of your experience?
I would say it was the end of the mechanism that keeps the cycle of the narrator going. So, there's still some momentum going on after that shift, but
Mm.
the thing that would keep it going and going and going, that wasn't there anymore. So, yeah, it definitely started to slow down pretty quickly.
You said you went on a date. How did it? You still had the desire to go on dates after?
Yeah, there was kind of a curiosity, like, because there was such a distinct before and after type quality to what had happened. There was a curiosity to go um, back into the old life and just see what it would be like, you know. And it was very uh, different. Uh, it was really a world created for a character that was no longer there. That was so it was like inhabiting, stepping, in the movies where they make a movie about you kind of take on someone else's body and you enter their life, you interact with the people in their life, and it's so strange because it's not actually familiar to you at all.
Hmm.
Kind of like that. Yeah.
Since your story involved seeking women, did your relationship to women completely change after?
Yeah, there was less of a uh this intense need to have one, you know.
Hmm.
There was still, you know, an enjoyment of being around women and girls at the time. And but yeah, that definitely took a hit, you know. Yeah. Yeah, there was one instance where again, I was curious, so I went out with a group of friends to, the bars at night. I went to a club or something, and after it was like 2 in the morning or something, we were leaving. We were walking in the street, and there was a girl that I had known from high school who was interested in me, and I had been interested in her. But things, the way my story went is I always sabotaged things before they got too intimate. So this time around, I was like, well, why not? Let's see what happens.
Hmm.
And so um, she literally that night grabbed me by the arm, took me to her car, drove to a hotel, paid for the hotel room, took me into the room, pulled my pants down. Um, but I didn't, have an erection because I had drank quite a bit, and it was all very
Oh,
sudden. So, basically like a worst case scenario for what would have been that character, right?
yeah.
And but it was just very strange. There was kind of a humor to it all while it was happening, and she was very frustrated,
Hmm.
and understandably, she had gone to a lot of trouble. Um,
You weren't judging yourself?
well, that old storyline was there. It came up for a moment, but it was very strange. It was like I said, it was kind of like I was in another role that wasn't
Hmm.
me anymore. So there was a strange kind of detachment there. And yeah, I just remember, we quickly exited the room, and she was, really pissed off. And I think she was taking it personally. Like I didn't think she was um, attractive or something like that. I don't know, but she wasn't happy. And so halfway through the drive, I just said, you can let me out here. And so I got out of the car, and I was really far from home at that point. So I just walked to the train tracks and just started walking on the tracks. And it was this beautiful full moon
Hmm.
lighting up the tracks. And I just walked on those tracks for a long time to get home. And as I was walking, I remember just bursting out loud with laughter uh, at what had just happened. And because I knew that had that happened to the other guy, the other character,
Hmm.
uh, you know, that would have sent him right to a bridge to jump off of. It was like worst case scenario. And I realized at that point, it didn't really matter what happened to me anymore. And nothing could actually, kill me. Nothing could, there was nobody there to really get killed.
Hmm.
So there was such a joyful, if you could imagine, just guy jumping up in the air, clicking his heels, laughing under the moonlight on a set of train tracks. That's what it was like.
It's a very common thing we hear about awake people bursting into laughter. I think Osho Osho's story has like a similar where he burst out into laughter when he achieved awakening.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. It's like, yeah, you realize the hilarity of it all, the strangeness of the human drama because it can seem so serious. It
mm,
really does seem so serious for until, it's not. And um, I just thought of you remember the movie critics Siskel and Ebert?
yeah. Hmm.
I don't know if I talked about this already, but the bigger guy, Siskel.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, on his deathbed, he was in and out of consciousness. And just before he died, he snapped it, awake, and his wife was there, and she's like, and he was laughing hysterically, kind of like a huge grin on his face, and she's like, "What's going on?" And he was like, "It's all a hoax. It's all an elaborate hoax." And that is impossible not to laugh at once you start to see it all for what it is.
So back in your early 20s, how did it affect your like friendship with your guy friends in your
Yeah,
college days?
yeah, the high school friends, that quickly fell apart. That didn't last very long. Up until that point, when I was going through, an intensive kind of meditative phase, before I had had that shift happen, I had started to become more distant from, the friends that I hung around. And, they used to call me the Phantom because I would just kind of be at their house or be at a party and I would just disappear. And
Mm,
I would leave because I wasn't aligning with anything inside of me anymore. Uh, and then after that shift happened, and like I said, I was curious. I went out with them a few times around that circle of people, and it was just obvious it was over. There was no compatibility at all, and I still enjoyed their ways, but
mm,
it was just like it just didn't fit, you know. And at one point, uh, I had to kind of distinctly. Actually, there was one point I was really kind of really exploring the contrast of things because I remember sitting at a pub with a couple of the guys that I hung around and after I had gone through that shift and they were concerned or at least they seemed to be concerned. They were like, "What's going
mm,
on with you? You've been acting. You like don't come out anymore." And I was like, "Oh, what the hell?" So I said, something has happened to me and I've realized blah 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 blah, and of course the looks on their faces were just like, what are you talking about? And then so for fun I was just like, I realized, there's only one of us in the room, and
mm,
I knew that one would be the topper, and when I said that, there's whoa, who bet? Like, what are you talking about? Like,
mm. It's got
uh,
crazy.
things just got really weird, and
Mm,
but at that point, I had already acknowledged and accepted that the whole thing was going to end.
mm,
So I did after that. I just stopped calling and I stopped calling. And then in college, I never really made the effort to make much connections because my first year I was already knee deep in hell.
yeah.
And then the second year, I had no interest in making connections at all. So,
Not even girls?
I still was attracted to girls and, you know,
Mm.
but no, I didn't make too much of an effort. I thought the ones at college thought I was just weird. So I didn't really try there, but
Mm.
yeah.
Did it affect your like academics, taking tests and
Uh,
memorizing?
no, it actually was, I found it become easier because there was very little distraction. There was no personal story that was worrying about understanding things or,
Mm.
not getting things or not doing it right or none of that was there. So it was just like, here's an assignment, go do it. It's like, okay, boom, done. And yeah, and it was the quality improved, you know, uh, because everything I worked on, I was fully there,
Mm.
and there was all kinds of creativity that was now allowed in, and so yeah.
When you were sitting in class listening to the teacher, was that a completely different experience?
Uh, yeah, I remember the first year of college, the teacher really enjoyed, one of the teachers I could tell enjoyed, and the students kind of like trying to please him, trying to suck
Mm.
up to him, kind of, and and I must have been doing that on some level because the
Mm.
second year I went back after things had changed. I was like, nope, not doing that. And so I was more aware of the ego needs of everybody in the class, where they were all coming from. So all of that was very
Mm.
pronounced. And I saw it was just all one big game of love me, going on. So that was definitely pronounced.
Since you were in college, did the shift affect your career choice and graduation and getting a job?
Yeah, yes and no. Uh, before before I went into college, I was like, I'm gonna work for National Geographic. I'm gonna be this photographer that gets to travel and get his pictures put in a magazine. That was kind of the ego goal there. And then after that, um, yeah, I could have cared less about it. And
Mm.
but I did. Things still came together a lot more easily. I was hired as a weekend photographer at a local newspaper, and then I went out to Vancouver after college and was eventually offered a full-time job doing that. And it all started to come together pretty effortlessly, and I didn't actually care that much about it anymore, which was funny.
And throughout your 20s after graduating, how was your social life and dating and
Yeah, yeah. The social stuff mostly happened through um, when I would hold like satsang meetings at my place. I didn't really
mm.
have an interest in making friends outside of that environment. Because in a way I saw what that whole friend stuff is, which is just here's the agreement, I'll
Mm.
agree to, you know, support your idea of who you think you are, so long as you agree to support the idea of who I think I am.
Mm.
It was always some unworthiness exchange, which is at the heart of most friendships, really. I don't know, I'm not saying there's no such thing as friendship, but, um, real friendship is just automatic, really.
Mm.
When you're like, for example, when we first met, you were an instant friend. Right? It's not like
Mm.
I needed to get to know you,
Oh, okay.
because I could care less about what I would find out about you.
Mm.
No offense.
Yeah, the story.
Yeah, the story stuff. Yeah. But
Hmm.
it's always an immediate friendship. In fact, I have billions of friends now, so it's great.
Um, so you eventually had an interest in dating again after?
Yeah, that was a funny thing. Um, yeah, there was still a curiosity there to explore that. Um, I didn't quite know how to go about it because I wasn't plugged into the old social circles where you would normally meet, a girl.
Hmm.
And so I took to the online world and I went on some dating apps and Lava Life was big at the time. And of course, I was terrible at, uh, I was very naive about, I don't know, what's the word? I started to become kind of ignorant of the social ways of the world. And
Oh.
so, for example, I met with a girl at a cafe through Lava Life. And
Hmm.
as soon as we sat down and got our coffees, I told her the whole, Playboy story and the personal,
Hmm.
intimate sexual story and just fully unloaded onto her. And at one point I looked closer and I could see the terror in her eyes. And,
Okay.
you know, um, yeah. And then eventually, I was, at that point, I still hadn't, had sex with anybody, which was a big part of the personal story. But I knew I was ready for it on some level. And it was just something that, physiologically wanted to happen and was necessary in a way to move through to further highlight the fact of its unimportance. And
Hmm.
I was invited to do a retreat in Hawaii. And the fellow that had invited me was currently staying in San Francisco. And he had started to post posters in San Francisco of the retreat in Hawaii. And I was in Vancouver at the time. And there was a woman there who just emailed me one day and um, I was like, "Hey, I saw your poster. I think we're supposed to meet." And I was like, "Okay." So I hopped on a plane,
Hmm.
flew to San Francisco and met with her and beautiful soul. And I got to have that first sexual experience with her and yeah, it was just, but it was in a very loving, supportive atmosphere, much different than what I would have expected,
Hmm.
growing up. So it was a beautiful way of bringing a kind of a personal story close to that whole thing. And then, yeah, things have evolved relationship wise since then.
You said I think we're supposed to meet. Did you have some like after awakening, some like intuitive powers? Like this feels right and this is where I'm supposed to go.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I didn't look at him like I'm a superhero kind of thing. It was her actually that had said, I think we're supposed to meet. That was her email.
Hmm.
And I just had a strong sense that there was something there. And I did recognize her when I first saw her. Not that I had met her before, but I'm sure you've had that experience where you meet people that you don't really have a backstory with, but they
Hmm.
seem very familiar. And I, I think that has to do with just you're familiar with them from beyond this life. But we can save that for another conversation.
Yeah. So we can go a little bit back in the story and after college. how did you navigate your career choices, like getting a
Yeah,
job and getting
yeah,
apartment and all those things?
yeah. So it was everything was still for the first time for me. I had when I left college, when I was in college, I was still living with my parents. I was like 21, 22, and then when I finished college, I knew I had to leave. It was time to create space there, so I moved very far away. And that was all a first time thing, and so having to learn how to, you know, do all of these things on my own, you know, for the first time, get my own place and get a job and buy my own toilet paper, and so there was periods of big heart openings there because it wasn't just that; it was also coinciding with this expanding
Mm.
experience of life, and so I remember when I left my parents, I briefly stayed with some cousins in Port Coquitlam and Vancouver, and they was like, yeah, you can stay here for a few months, and so I was like, great, and during that time, I started to look for jobs, and I noticed that there was some old programming still around, insufficiency around there being enough of whatever. In this instance, it was jobs, being able to get a job or something. Because the first place that called me back for a job was a department store
Mm.
decorating Christmas trees. And so I went there, and the first day on the job, I was sitting in front of the teacher who was telling us how to properly decorate a Christmas tree. And a couple of women were sitting beside me, and one of them was like, "Oh, I'm just so glad that I got this job because the job market is virtually non-existent in Vancouver." And as soon as she said that, I was like, a big smack across the face. And I was
Mm.
like, Kyle, what are you doing? So I smiled and I realized that was the last day on that job. So I
Mm.
went back and really sat quietly. After seeing that, it was, you know, a really big message to just go deeper into this trust stuff. And then I came across a couple of instances in a very short period of time of a passage from the Sermon on the Mount, which is a part of the New Testament with Jesus.
Yeah.
And I don't know what your religious background is, if you're familiar that much with the whole Jesus stuff.
Yeah. Hmm.
Anyway,
The money changers and
yeah, all that stuff.
yeah.
And but there was a part of the Sermon on the Mount where he says something along the lines of, uh, who of you would give your son, a stone if he were to ask for bread, and you being evil are able to give such things to your children, how much more can your Father in heaven give to you if you ask? And if you put aside all the silly patriarchal, or not patriarchal, but parental language, I
Mm.
think patriarch, I'll have to get my dictionary. Anyway, put all that aside, it was just saying trust. Just, uh, you have really zero reason to distrust life, that it'll provide you with what you need. And so I quit that job, and there was a big heart opening moment there, I remember. And and shortly after, I got a call for a much, more stable job, more reflective of my skill set and all that stuff. So
Mm.
yeah.
And during all these early years, you were just starting the early years of the satsang, and your first years as like a beginner teacher.
Yeah, exactly. I knew that I was never really going to care very much about a job out there in the world or a career because what I had woken up to was
Mm.
far more engaging than anything I could ever do as a career. So it became just a kind of logical that I tried to make a career of this somehow. So yeah, I threw myself into the spiritual
Mm.
teacher industry and started doing some research.
Uh, which teachers influenced you? Was there like a list that you have, or over time, who did you learn from?
Uh, in the beginning, when I was in high school, there haven't really been many. I think I can really honestly say there's two probably, and that would be Don Miguel Ruiz
Mm.
and Eckhart Tolle, and that was it. The other ones, there's been lots of other wonderful ones that I've come across that have helped in some ways. Adyashanti was a very helpful one in the beginning because when I was kind of doing the market research,
Mm.
uh, his delivery style felt like it was the closest to how I naturally share. And so I
Mm.
benefited from observing him um, you know,
Eventually, you decided to stop teaching, and
yeah,
'cause
yeah, yeah, it was, I think I gave it a few years in Vancouver, holding meetings and doing the teacher thing. Uh, but I started to see that the way in which I had shaped things
mm.
was still kind of out of alignment. Didn't quite feel right. Felt a little too mm, boxed up and packaged, kind of like, I had followed too many cues from observing other teachers and satsangs that I had attended, and it just didn't feel in alignment anymore. And so, yeah, I
Mm.
just decided at one point, I was just like, yeah, time to take a break from that. And then I got into a long-term relationship, the one I'm still in, and
Mm.
had kids. And, eventually I was like, all right, it's time to get my feet wet again. And then you and I met shortly after that, actually, I think.
Destiny.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think earlier you said during your first time dating, you forgot like how people behave. Were you not like hanging out with people throughout the 20s?
Yeah. No, I always felt from a young age that socializing was very tiring and and didn't really enjoy it much. Probably
Mm.
because it was obvious all of the superficiality of it all that was required. And
Mm.
if you think about how many social interactions you have, how much a superficial expectation is there, right? So
Mm.
I never really was interested in that. So, and I had even less need to do it at that point. So, and I didn't feel like I was lacking. That's the other thing. It's like, so it's perfectly okay to, be a loner.
Mm.
And, so that's how it is anyway. So yeah,
Yeah, like were you still like watching movies and
yeah, yeah. I
listening to
mean,
music?
they're really, yeah. My regular routine would be to,
Mm.
I don't know, I would go for walks every day especially at nighttime. Uh, I just walked a lot, and then kind of a ritual became going to rent a movie and
Mm.
go to the superstore, buy a donut, you know, and yeah, just lots of walking and lots of donuts.
Did you appreciate movies in a different way after awakening? Or,
I enjoyed the artistry and the creativity,
mm,
but there was a difference. It was no longer as enjoyable in a way because I could never fully stop seeing that they were actors pretending.
mm,
When you watch a movie, at some point you just kind of go and
mm,
you just totally accept that they're really that person and that's really happening. So that was not
yeah.
able to happen anymore. So
Mm,
in that way, it wasn't as fun, but I just found other ways to enjoy it. Just seeing like human beings really enjoying, a craft and being talented at it. So,
mm.
yeah.
And how about sports? Did you see sports in a different way?
Oh yeah, yeah. I enjoyed being athletic, but the huge part of sports is competitiveness, and
Mm,
I wasn't really competitive anymore, and so now I that whole thing died. And I was a pretty big athlete in high school,
oh,
football and
okay.
soccer and all that. But yeah, it's all just
Uh,
aside from throwing a frisbee, it's kind of pointless.
okay, so you met your wife and then you had children. Uh, how did it affect your style of parenting and raising your children?
Yeah. Um, it definitely, I realized after having kids that you adopt certain programming from the world that you don't even realize you've adopted. Uh, Expectations, maybe it's absorbed from media and things like that about what it's like to be a parent and all that. And so there's a lot of those old societal norms that got broken down pretty quickly after having kids.
Mm.
And just seeing that as a human being, I'm far from perfect. And so there's mistakes made along the way, if you want to call them mistakes. I wouldn't really call them mistakes, just the natural, inevitable, unfolding of life, I guess. But yeah, it's the biggest thing that's always been there for me with having kids is a hands-off type of approach.
Mm.
Not to be disconnected from them, not spend time with them. I just mean not try to meddle with them and teach them how to be alive, kind of thing. It's just to help
Mm.
prevent them from hurting themselves mostly, and play with them. That's pretty much it.
Mm.
And give them food, put some clothes on them.
Right.
Yeah.
So eventually you made a decision to come back into the spiritual teaching world. What led to that decision to come back?
Yeah. So I had left for about 10 years
Mm.
and got to another point where I was thinking about, okay, what, where to focus my attention again for work. And um, came back to the same conclusion. And so, well, I'm pretty well versed now in the ways of this spiritual stuff. So might as well put the spiritual teacher hat back on. But I knew that I didn't want to, like I said, the old container felt really out of alignment. So this time around, it was like, how could I get back into this game but not repeat the old stuff? So I started just by writing off the cuff. The first few books I wrote from a grammatical place would probably make some scholar want to vomit, you know. They're pretty poorly structured and stuff, but I just started writing, you know, when the kids were at the playground, I'd pull out a notepad and just start writing. And that was the entrance into it. And at first, when I started writing, I was noticing I was kind of structuring it in a way that seemed spiritually correct.
Mm.
And then I was like, well, something's off about this. So I sat quietly and I was like, well, how would you really write? How would you really express, you know, if you weren't adhering to any of that stuff? And then what started to come through felt a lot more in alignment, you know.
Has the teaching experience been much better over the last 10 years coming back?
Yeah, yeah, a lot more enjoyable because there's not really a sense of having to fulfill a role per se. You know, I
Mm.
still have to call myself a teacher and plug the whole awakening story and give people context for why they should meet with me and all that stuff, you know, but I don't feel as compelled to have to show up like looking like something, you know.
Mm. Um, well, I've known you for many years, so sometimes I'm like, Kyle's just a normal guy a lot of the times.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful thing to say because that means that, you know, my approach has been largely free of, you know, perpetuating the unhelpful spiritual BS
Mm.
that's out there. So yeah, that's good. Yeah,
There,
yeah, sorry, go on.
well, there are like a few instances that are not normal. Like, I'd say like about a year ago, I put a comment on one of your videos, and you sent me an email saying, "I think we should make a podcast together." And my immediate thought was, I was already thinking that, and I'm living thousands of miles away from you. And then
Yeah,
we talked about it over Zoom, and you called it the nudge.
yeah, yeah. There's lots of nudges. We're always being given nudges. It's not just me,
Mm.
but definitely, yeah. Even before you had made that comment, you had come up in my, you know, periphery.
Mm.
Uh, and I had thought about you, and it was just a fond recollection, really, of our hanging out, and then you literally like a day later commented, and then whenever that happens, I always know it's like, okay, there's a big arrow pointing this way,
Mm.
and you know, and then it was like I always felt like the type of conversation that we have would do well for it seems relatable, I think, to a lot of
Mm.
folks. You know, it feels organic and stuff. So yeah, and then it was just, oh, why don't you mention that to him? Yeah,
So was that like your navigation style after awakening? You see that arrow pointing.
yeah, it's a lot more enjoyable to live that way, anyways.
Mm.
You know, just not being the one who's saying, I got to go here now, I got to go there now. This is how it's gonna go, and just
Mm.
be along for the ride. You know, and it seems life always has the most interesting things in store when you let that happen.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. That was the new episode of Non-Duality with Kyle Hubin and Saeed. We'll see you on the next episode.